Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeremy, and I am a representative of EHN Canada. We are a nationwide network of treatment centers for addiction, trauma, and mental health. We have facilities located in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. We offer high-quality inpatient, outpatient, and online treatment programs. For more information, please visit our website at www.ehncanada.com. Just in terms of housekeeping, everyone is on mute and cameras are off for today's webinar, but please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions for our speaker. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. Again, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box to ensure we can get to your question if we have time. And please remember that this is a professional and inclusive space, and offensive commentary will not be accepted nor tolerated. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out a follow-up email next week that will include a link to the video, today's slide deck, as well as additional resources, and of course, your CEU certificate. That will be sent sometime mid to late next week. We appreciate your patience. I am located in Toronto. Toronto is located on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. We also have presence today at our Edgewood facility located in Nanaimo, British Columbia. They are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people and the traditional territory of the Sunimuk First Nation. Vancouver is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you are new to this work and want to find out whose land you are on or grew up on, check out native-land.ca. Many more of you may be physically present elsewhere, and I encourage everyone to use the chat function to, where applicable, share whose land you are on. Now, to get to today's session, Suicide Ideation, we have Ryan Slobodian. Ryan has worked in mental health and addictions for the past 9 years. While counseling vulnerable homeless youth and young adults in Calgary, he saw firsthand how addiction and trauma interact and the immense impact it has on people. Working with these survivors, Ryan developed a passion for treatment in this field. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology through the University of Calgary and earned a Master of Counseling degree from City University of Seattle, and also engaged in original research on belongingness and stigma reduction during this time. Ryan is certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy and accelerated resolution therapy for the treatment of psychological trauma. He is currently a registered clinical counselor with the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counselors and a member of the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, where he is now a certified sex addiction therapist. Please help me welcome Ryan Slobodian.
Hello. Thanks for joining us today. I have the pleasure of sharing with you again. I always love doing these webinars. It's a little bit dicey getting into work today. Had the snow hit us last night, which we're not exactly used to here on Vancouver Island. So always interesting with that. I'm going to share screen here. Get my slides up. Hopefully you can all see that. Let me know if you can't. So yeah, today we're gonna talk about suicide. Always a difficult topic to talk about, but one that's obviously very important. First, I'd like to start off by talking about language. So, I find it really important just to start with this because I think terms and phrases that we use can have a really significant impact on way messages are received and, how things, how mental health is kind of treated in society. So first, I'll go into the useful. So we like to use kind of took your own life, or died by suicide. There's research to kind of show, or even attempted suicide. So there's research to show that there's lots of high acceptability with these phrases, stigma reduction. So yeah, these are the terms that I like to use. So we avoid committed suicide because it's kind of associated with like a criminal action. So to commit something, and that's not how we want to. It's not how we want to frame suicide. It can really bring about feelings of shame, stigma, guilt. Can be hurtful to survivors who have lost people to suicide, people who have attempted. And there can be a perceived negative bias for people to actually reach out for help. So we don't like to use committed. Another term that gets thrown around is successful or unsuccessful. There is no success in this. So I like to avoid that at all costs. So yeah, those are some of the terms. Also wanted to start with kind of just looking at whether basically certain topics that people struggle with in terms of being fact or myth. First one I'll do is talking about somebody, talking to or asking someone if they've had suicidal thoughts is helpful. It would be, I'm used to kind of talking in front of people, so usually I'd get feedback right away, but I'll just kind of answer it. Basically, this is helpful. Sometimes people think that if I talk directly about it, then the person's more likely to maybe get triggered or kind of act on any suicidal thoughts. That's typically not what we see. Talking directly about it to kind of someone who's showing warning signs or is at risk can actually lower anxiety, open up communication, lower risk of an impulsive act, and also for the person kind of in the supportive helping role, it's good to kind of just see whether or not somebody's seriously considering it. So that's actually quite important, which I'll touch on a bit later too, to be very direct. Number two, a person who talks about attempting suicide rarely follows through. A person is probably just trying to get attention. This one's interesting because I hear this a lot. So people, yes, people can use suicide to I guess cry wolf, as they say, but typically that's not what's happening. The person's in extreme emotional pain. Nobody's going to just be talking about this because they're doing well. So we need to take everything seriously. There can be lots of jokes thrown around, about ending one's life. And sometimes it's easy to maybe brush it off, but always kind of take any sort of comment seriously. So yeah, that's, and really it's a sign that they might need help. Whether or not they're going to attempt suicide, that's really not, I guess, not the point. It's that they're struggling and they need some support. So taking everything seriously. Number three, there is really nothing you can do to help someone who is truly suicidal. So there is. So it can be a difficult topic to talk about, and people kind of balk at it. But there's lots you can do. People who are contemplating suicide usually don't want to die. They're in pain. They want to stop the pain. They're trying to reach out for help. And really, it's providing that help and support can be very powerful. So we'll get to that a bit later as well in terms of relational support and building community. But there is lots you can do to help. People who attempt suicide and survive will most likely attempt again. That is true. So people who, it's not just kind of a one-time thing, or maybe somebody kind of gets scared and doesn't do it again. Most likely, they will make additional attempts. There's a typical profile for a person who may attempt suicide. So, okay, this may be a little tricky one. So depression, suicide can affect anyone regardless of age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Keyword is can affect anybody. So we know that there's like depression, suicide doesn't pick and choose. However, there are certain populations that are more at risk, and we'll get into that a bit later. So yes, it doesn't choose, but there's also populations that are higher risk. We'll get to that later. Okay. Suicide typically occurs with warning signs. So yeah, nearly the stats are about 80%. Somebody who plans an attempt will often give clues in the form of warning signs. And we should always kind of take those seriously and ask what's going on. Okay, moving on here. So just a few statistics to start. So every year, approximately, this is just right off of StatsCan actually, 4,500 people die in Canada by suicide. That's about 10 people or 12 people a day. That is a lot of people. And really, when we look at attempting, we're looking at 200 daily. That is very, very high. At-risk categories. So men and boys. So this one's interesting. I have a lot of experience kind of working with men and really seeing their struggles to be vulnerable about emotions and inner experience. I'm currently working with a client. We've been kind of going through his trauma for probably about the past 9 months. The next step forward I challenged him to do is join a men's group to try to increase intimacy and vulnerability with other men, build a support network. And the session after, he came and he was just very emotional. He was in tears. He said, "I'm in my late 50s, and this is the first time I've ever kind of been vulnerable with another man, and it feels very uncomfortable." He kind of got in touch with how lonely he has been in his life, and I think it just calls for more. We need more spaces for men to talk about feelings and to be vulnerable with one another and seek support. Again, I'll get a bit more into that later with culture, but really important. Veterans. I've had the honor to work with our veterans in my day-to-day, and I really see how much they carry, and how they can go into some pretty dark places for all the help and support they've given communities, country, and that takes a toll. And the trauma can get so bad that's kind of the only way out of emotional pain. And I've like I say, I've had the honor of working with our veterans, and that is something I consistently see. So prison, feeling obviously trapped, hopeless, and then minority populations. I'm going to get into that a bit later too, so I won't fully touch on that right now. That'll be a big part of the presentation later. So, and women have higher rates of self-harm. Men have higher rates of suicide, but self-harm is a risk factor, and obviously needs to be taken very seriously. Okay, warning signs. So we need to differentiate between a warning sign and a risk factor. So warning signs are specific behavioral emotional clues that may indicate suicidal intent, and they're detectable. So again, specific, and behavioral and emotional clues. So I kind of split them up into three categories: of voicing, behaving, and emoting. So voicing, so somebody kind of voicing wanting to die, life is, there's nothing to kind of live for. Maybe somebody's expressing extreme guilt and shame, maybe being a burden to family members, loved ones, indicating there's no point to life. Something else I often see are like existential concerns, so like around like meaningless of existence. And I mean, we could go down a whole philosophical rabbit hole with that, but I'll avoid that for this webinar. But those are kind of the things you'd be concerned if you're hearing. And there's definitely others. I'm sure you kind of all seen them in day-to-day work, but those are kind of the ones I came up with. Emoting, so empty, hopeless, trapped, not having, again, feeling lonely, sad, depressed, oftentimes even like rage, anger, really just unbearable emotional or physical pain. So maybe like long-term illness, and then behaving. So making a plan, researching ways to attempt. Withdrawing is a big one too. Withdrawing, saying goodbye to friends, family, giving away important items, making a will, taking dangerous risks. So you may just kind of risky behavior as well. Increase in that is a concern. Big mood swings, eating, sleeping more, less, and often like an increase in drugs and alcohol or other addictive behavior. So those are kind of the warning signs, and you'll often see kind of like this, maybe a slow change where it gets these warning signs get worse over time, or it can be very quickly, maybe after a very stressful, traumatic event. So just definitely things to notice, and if they're kind of continuing or getting worse, then really having a conversation, which we'll get to in a second, on how to have that conversation. So risk factors. So break them down: individual, relationship, community, society. So these differ from warning signs. They're they're conditions and circumstances that may elevate a person's risk for suicide. So again, it's not kind of that specific behavioral, emotional sign that you can see. It's more just underlying conditions and circumstances. So individual, so let's start with that. So any sort of like previous attempts, history of depression, other mental health issues like bipolar, schizophrenia, trauma, anything like that, chronic pain, so serious illness, maybe significant legal problems, criminal problems, job and financial loss is a big one as well. Again, substance use fits into this category in individual. And what we also look for is history of adverse childhood experiences, and again, trauma. Relationship. So history of bullying, very difficult attachment relationships in families. So maybe ones that are quite cold and distant, or high conflict, violent, lack of safety. I would just say also feeling kind of a lack of attachment to caregivers, loved ones. So social isolation is huge actually. Social isolation is, I would say, one of the biggest risk factors out there. Get into that a bit more later too. So that's kind of on the relational. I'd say any sort of high conflict relationship, whether that's family or like a romantic partner, even relationship with work, that can be difficult as well. Community, so lack of access to healthcare, that's really important. So if somebody has less opportunity to reach out and seek support, that's an issue. Perhaps there's more suicide in their community. There can be historical trauma, so intergenerational trauma, discrimination, which is a big risk factor that we're going to talk about really shortly. Society, stigma with help seeking behavior around mental health is huge. That's on a societal level something we need to address. We're obviously getting better, but there's still so much work that needs to be done. That is huge. That on a societal level, also, I guess I'll address this in protective factors, but really creating some social change around access to mental health care, and then all sorts of other social change, equality, inclusion, those sorts of things. So causes of suicide are extremely complex. It's really hard to, I think this is, in my opinion, why suicide is a very kind of scary topic to go into sometimes, is because it doesn't really fit into this neat, tidy box that we can just treat with, it's just very complex. We have to look at all these risk factors and underlying conditions, and we kind of have to start kind of treating all of those, and it's kind of scary to go into. We don't, it doesn't fit into a neat, tidy box. And many who experience and exhibit risk factors don't die by suicide. Something interesting to talk about is how the suicide rate has increased. So the suicide rate for ages 10 to 24 increased nearly 60% between 2007 and 2018. That is significant increase. So that kind of gives us clues. So the causes of suicide, again, it's complex, but it really does give us clues. When we're looking at kind of biological, psychological, social, when we're looking at biological, we might be looking at genetics. I'm not a doctor, I'm not, but I don't think genes change that fast in 11 years, where something increases by 60%. To me, we have to start looking socially. We have to look at our communities. We have to look at, society, and start addressing maybe some toxicity in our society, and that's what we'll get into right now. So, Indigenous suicide rate in Canada is 3 times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. That's significant. Suicide is the leading cause of death in the 2S LGBTQ plus community, 4 times more likely to die by suicide than their peers. Again, extremely significant. Black children twice as likely to die by suicide compared to their peers. In general, minority populations experience greater suicide risk. When we see these statistics, we have to start asking ourselves some tough questions regarding why this is, and we kind of have to take a look, a broader look at things, and look at why these stats are the way they are. Something that's helped me with these stats and understanding them a bit. I've probably mentioned her in previous webinars, but I had the chance to get trained by Dr. Shelley Craig out of the University of Toronto, her Affirm model, and really she's looking at she's really looking at how discrimination kind of trickles down and affects the self. Starts with culture, goes into community, goes into family, and then into the self. So really, when we look at it, again, if I kind of had an audience in front of me, I'd ask you for examples of how, we experience a shame-based culture. I mean, shame-based culture is big business, right? If I'm constantly not good enough, I need something to make me good enough, and a lot of people are searching for that. So when we have negative messages about a minority group, and when that sometimes, so when we look at the 2S LGBTQ plus community, for example, when family starts to potentially buy into those views, the child, the adolescent, is often faced with internalized shame around, there's just something wrong with me. I had the absolute pleasure of listening to one of my best friends talk yesterday. He gave a presentation on his experience being a Black man growing up on Vancouver Island, and just the amount of loneliness and isolation he felt growing up, and how when he went to treatment, they put him on suicide watch, and that was a big thing for him. That really affected him, just to see how much his disconnection and loneliness impacted him, to the point where he was kind of at the place of wanting to take his own life. I see this a lot. I working with a client who's constantly worried about his voice being too high, or him being too feminine, not acceptable by society. He's better off being alone. He's in so much emotional pain that sometimes the thing that holds him together is this idea that he can end his life. And that's something that we're constantly working through and addressing in safety planning. But it just kind of goes to show this trickle down effect of, if I don't belong and I don't fit in, I'm being discriminated against. That's going to be internalized at some point. And I think I'm jumping ahead, so I'm going to change slides. Yeah, internalized oppression, racism, and negative core beliefs about the self. So when you're constantly told that you don't fit in, you don't belong, you start to internalize that. So, looking at some of Tara Brock's work around, the trance of unworthiness, you're constantly going to be, you're disconnected from self, and then you're going to be disconnected from others. If I feel unworthy, I'm also unworthy of connection with other, and that's very isolating. It's a huge risk factor. So I like that model in terms of showing how this kind of works. I'm also going to play this video. It kind of highlights what I'm talking about with society.
This culture that we live in that doesn't serve the health, that undermines the health of many of the people living in it. And you can look upon illness either as some random misfortune that hits people, very rarely dictated by genetics, but mostly just we don't know what causes it, it's just bad luck, too bad. Or we can actually say, well, maybe there's something about the way we live that contributes to people's illness. And I'm saying that in this culture, illness is not an abnormality, it's actually a normal response to abnormal circumstances. So that's where the meaning of normal comes into it. See, from the medical point of view, there's a range of normal that corresponds to what is healthy and what is natural. So outside a certain spectrum of body temperature, you can't live. If your body temperature goes too low or goes too high, you can't live. outside a certain level of blood acidity, you can't sustain life. Beyond a certain range of blood pressure, if it's too low or too high, you don't live. So in that sense, the normal range corresponds to what is healthy and what is natural. But we make the assumption in this society that what we're used to, in other words, what is norm to us, is also healthy and natural. And I'm saying it's a dangerous assumption, in fact, quite false, so that what is considered to be normal in this culture is neither healthy nor is it natural, unlike in that strict medical sense. Well, so there's two ways you can hurt people. One is you do bad things to them, such as mistreat them. Now that happens on the individual level in the case of child abuse and so on, of which there's plenty. And on the social level, in the form of the inequalities that British research has clearly shown to be a major source of ill health. Very world-famous researchers here in England have been pioneers, in Michael Marmot and others, showing the impact of inequality. In fact, just yesterday in The Guardian, the Bishop of London was talking about health inequalities in this culture. So you saw that during COVID. Who was most likely to fall ill and to die of COVID? By significant percentages, it would be people of minorities, color, low socioeconomic status, and so on. So that inequality, and then the embedded racism and all kinds of other prejudices that beset people. What corresponds to on individual level to be individual abuse, you might say, is on a social level, the social abuse. So that's one way to hurt people, is just to do bad things to them. I mean, there was a study just 3 weeks ago, just as the book was being published, another study in the States showing that in the aftermath of racism, a racist episode, a person's immune system's activity diminishes and their hormone level changes. Just one episode like that. So there's plenty of that kind of hurting people. But the other way you can hurt people is by depriving them of their needs. So we all have a need for oxygen. You know, I don't have to hit you, but I could badly hurt you by sucking the oxygen out of this room. I'm saying that people have certain needs. Children have certain essential needs without which they don't develop health in a healthy way. And adults have certain needs, and this society deprives them of those needs. So both in the active sense of imposing hurt on people and in the more passive sense of depriving them of their needs, it's a toxic culture. In this society, people are actually trained to ignore their instincts. I mean, I give the example of my mother who writes in her diary, when I was 2 weeks of age, "Poor little Gabor, my heart is breaking for you because you've been crying to be fed for the last hour and a half. But I promised the doctor I'll only feed you every 4 hours, so I'll have to let you cry for another half an hour." Her instinct was to pick me up and to hold me. That's the maternal instinct. But she was stifling her instinct in order to comply with medical advice. By the way, medical advice that I myself used to give until I found out better, like let the baby cry it out, let them go back to sleep, all this kind of nonsense that totally inimical to human development, but which advice that we give to parents all the time. And I could go down the line in all the ways that parenting is undermined in this culture. So we get the early years wrong, and then we wonder why so many kids are being diagnosed with everything under the sun.
So I think pretty powerful message on kind of illness. I would, so including mental health and kind of a normal response to what we're experiencing in society, specifically around minority populations. Just even hearing about the impact of immune system on basically a traumatic event, which like when you look at like a racist event and the immune system being impacted like that, we're starting to look at immune systems and mental health being very connected. So more research to come on that, but really important work. Now I want to get into, I'm realizing I'm kind of running low on time, so I want to get into the just general steps to take. Really, the first step would be identifying signs, starting the conversation, and being direct, like we spoke about. So really, if you're seeing a warning sign and somebody has a underlying risk factor, I would definitely address that. I'd have a conversation with somebody that you're concerned about it. then just kind of listen, express concern, offer support. Just listen to what they have to say, listen to the pain they're experiencing. Be there, just be there to listen. That can be more helpful than people realize. I think sometimes people will feel like we have to do or fix. And I think just being there and offering that person even perceived social support is really important. So safety planning.
Ryan, sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just making the slides full screen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go. So a safety plan, if necessary. So if somebody is thinking about attempting suicide, so that would mean a safety plan. Access to anything lethal in the house, creating safety planning around that. What are some individual coping strategies that this person can utilize if in emotional distress? Making a list of support people that I find this is extremely helpful, that people can talk to, and then getting this person help. So sometimes that means hospital if it's serious enough. Sometimes that means an appointment right away with a therapist, psychologist. Support groups. Often find even with when I guess shamelessly plugging my research, the research I did online with Reddit and looking at different mental health communities, and even just posting on a mental health community subreddit and receiving feedback and getting some comments back can really increase someone's feeling of belongingness, reduce stigma and shame. So even just utilizing online supports is really important as well. It can really help. So lastly, I'll get into protective factors. So again, I'm going to split it into individual, relationship, community, societal. Individual, so we're if appropriate and we're not kind of crisis managing and just creating safety, this would be a time where we'd look at enhancing emotional regulation, distress tolerance skills, so looking at DBT to increase those, shown to be very effective when you're looking at emotional pain. Maybe somebody's having difficulty managing, staying within the window of tolerance. So we'd look at doing those sorts of skills. And then addressing underlying trauma, underlying risk factors. So we saw earlier in the presentation how many risk factors, and there's probably many more that I didn't talk about. So making sure that we're addressing all of those as well. Identifying any diagnoses that may require medication, maybe schizophrenia, bipolar, and when you kind of have a good clinical picture, we're better able to manage risk factors and treat them accordingly. So, if somebody is maybe presenting borderline personality, obviously we have kind of DBT skills to work through, programs to work through that can enhance ability to stay within window of tolerance, regulate, manage distress, increase interpersonal skills. So we're better able to tackle those if we have a good clinical picture. And something that I've taken the liking to around internal family systems is really just viewing suicide as a really a part. So if anyone's familiar with internal family systems, they call it firefighters, managers, and exiles in terms of a kind of a three-part system. Managers are kind of born out of trauma and manage the system, keep people safe. Exiles are their pain and their hurt, and firefighters come in when the managers can't hold the kind of hold stability and kind of douse the pain. We often see this in addiction. So emotional pain's too high. Their normal kind of, although dysfunctional coping strategies are not working. So to numb, using substances, processes, but looking also, suicide is really the kind of ultimate form of taking away somebody's pain. And when we kind of look at that from that IFS perspective, or, Gabor Mate's compassionate inquiry, what's kind of really happening, not why the suicide, why the pain. He often says that around addiction, not why addiction, why the pain. Can be very compassionate and destigmatizing, can really kind of try to understand somebody's experience and what they need in terms of support, rather than just kind of giving blanket skills or, sometimes I find that skills work is great, but it doesn't really understand the person's story and their struggles. So I think this can be a very compassionate approach to really just showing somebody that we care, and that we kind of know they don't want to die. They're just in a lot of pain. It's not a character flaw. It's a reaction to pain. Relationships. So building supportive relationships with partners, friends, and family. That's huge, although can be difficult, but that is ideal. Addressing relationship dysfunction. Where does this go? If it's high conflict and it's very dysregulating, is the couple working towards a new relationship? Does this need to end? Or because staying the same isn't an option. Those are kind of the three options that we go with in couples work. So was it that setting boundaries? What does that look like? Does a partner need to go to treatment? Taking a really good look at the couple relationship. I like to build strong connections with people with similar struggles. Joining a group process, I talked about earlier how powerful that is. Oftentimes people will come to treatment and say, this is kind of the first time in my life I've ever been vulnerable or feeling like intimate with somebody, and that's not a shock to me. They're talking about their emotions, they're talking about their pain, their struggles, and they're kind of letting people in. That's really important to decrease isolation. And like I said earlier, perceived social support and connection with others is really critically important. When we look at the state of somebody's mental health, it's often tied to their relational health. So, and community. So again, joining groups, building community, availability of kind of healthcare, mental health care. And I said earlier, belongingness, universality is an important protective factor. Even just knowing, this person's not alone and other people go through these types of struggles can be a huge relief for somebody, that they might have an outlet, somebody to talk to. And on the societal level, advocacy for all sorts of social change, reducing stigma around mental health supports. We're seeing more and more movements like that. We need more. And promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout society. I realize I'm here. Kind of a large portion of this topic is, me talking about, stigma, discrimination, and I'm kind of aware I'm a straight white guy talking about that. I'm not going to pretend I've experienced this. What I do bring, I like to think, is 2 open ears and some humility, and to learn from people and how I can be better for myself and be better for my community, and be an active agent in social change, and providing more inclusivity so people feel belonging and aren't going to feel lonely to the extent where they're so disconnected. They feel like suicide is their only option to take away their pain. I'd love to never have to talk about suicide because it's not an issue. That would be obviously a hope and dream, but obviously we got some work to do. So thank you for listening. I'll open it up for questions now.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Really appreciate it. So we will get into some questions. Okay. So is there any science or statistics regarding the mindsets of addicts or alcoholics who overdose, which could also simultaneously have been suicidal gestures?
In terms of statistics, I'd have to take a look. I wouldn't have it in front of me. But just anecdotally, when I look at, working in addiction, I don't know if it completely answers the question, but just from my experience, I often see people who have, when I'm doing an initial assessment with them, they've at least thought about suicide, a high percentage. In terms of maybe just not wanting to wake up the next day, kind of like not kind of actively attempting, but just that kind of hopeless wishing. But no, I don't have the stats in front of me. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much. There's a couple questions too surrounding assisted suicide. So there's obviously you brought up earlier the $4,500 a year with suicide, and they're wondering if that includes assisted suicide, but then also like perspectives with mental health and assisted suicide.
I don't believe it. I could double check, but I don't believe it is. I don't believe assisted suicide's in those numbers. It's a really kind of hotly debated topic. I think I don't really have a good solid answer on that. I think I think we have to allow people agency over their life. But I mean, it's obviously we're dealing with politics and all sorts of things, and it's kind of murky.
I was just going to say that's easily a webinar series on its own that we could definitely get people involved in, but it's very much a topical conversation for sure. And then there's a question, would a manipulative relationship be included as a risk factor?
Sure. Yeah. So often in manipulative relationships, they're so again, I could do a whole webinar on betrayal bonding and betrayal-based relationships. But manipulative behavior is highly involved in sort of betrayal-based relationships, and there's very high intensity in those relationships. So when there's high intensity, there's lots of dysregulation, and there's lots of chaos, and that is a huge risk factor, I would say, just because of those reasons. Sometimes people feel like the only way out is to attempt suicide, and that opens up a whole other conversation around attachment and why people engage in betrayal bonds, which I don't believe we have time for. But yes, the very basis, yes, is high risk factor.
Perfect, thank you. And then we do have confirmation that medically assisted suicide is not included within the 4,500 statistic. So just to keep everyone updated. And then lots of questions about COVID-19 and statistic rates as well, which again, I think could be its own webinar, and I'll ensure to include something as a resource for follow-up email as well. But we do have a question too. What are your go-to suicide assessment tools?
So I did, back when I was working in youth mental health, we used a lot of, Assist, which I found was really helpful. They do a really wonderful 2-day workshop to just really, I would say, enhance confidence in the skills. You probably take the workshop or take certain workshops and already realize you have the skills, but maybe just the confidence to implement them. I found that was a great tool, was Assist. It was very comprehensive. So I'd use that.
Assist was brought up quite a bit within the chat as well, people offering that as a support. So that's great to know. Thank you. And then there's a general question, more situational. If someone voiced suicide, quote unquote, I feel like killing myself and I may just do it via a text, what would the next proceeds be? Should you call the police? How should you go about that?
Yeah, so if somebody, like a loved one, was to contact you, and then the concern would be maybe you don't know where they are. Is that kind of the So if it got to that point, you definitely could get police involved to do like a welfare check. I've actually had to do that a couple times where somebody's called me. They've said they're and not in a really good state of mind. They've been maybe drinking and they're feeling just generally unwell, suicidal. And what the police can do, they can ping their phones that they've called from, and they can identify last kind of location. So that I would do that if there's a serious concern about it.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that as well. Back in my university days, as I was a residence advisor, so we were trained with safe talk and all that kind of stuff as well, and proceedings to contact like higher authorities such as the police if anything was to happen in those cases. So I would echo Ryan's sentiment and say to do the same. There is does having multiple risk factors compound the chance of suicidality?
I'd say generally yes. I think if we looked at, I haven't seen, obviously I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm very, very confident that if a study kind of looked at compounding risk factors, that there would definitely be an increase for sure. Like if we're looking at maybe like job loss, housing crisis, relationship difficulty, all of those things compounded, increased stress, increased kind of isolation, feeling trapped, no way out. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And then there's just more of a general question too. Again, I think this might be something that we have to engage further resources with, but which of the mental disorders is the highest risk for suicide, and which personality disorders?
Yeah, good question. I would say I'd have to look more into the stats on that. I think just looking at my scope of practice, I'd say like again, hard to say, but in my scope, I deal a lot with PTSD, and I'd say that's a really high risk factor. I think addiction as well, just feeling so kind of hopeless, out of control, unmanageable. We also saw kind of self-harm and emotional regulation issues. So we got to look maybe at borderline as well. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And then you spoke about like common signs and symptoms and clues and such when people might be suicidal. So someone's asking on the other hand, so some people don't really show clues and they're happy. So what can we do for them, and how can we know that they are going to take their own life?
Yeah, that's kind of tough. Those are kind of those 20%. We looked at 80% typically will show warning signs. There are people who we've kind of seen as generally very very happy, or who was it? I think there was a recent celebrity that died by suicide, and I can't remember now, but just generally like, very happy, very very involved in family, and then just one day kind of left and then died by suicide. So,
yeah, there's Robin Williams is often used as like the example of this. Twitch, yes, I was just going to say Twitch is the most recent as well, but it's sad. And again, like things like this with destigmatizing the conversation and making sure things are accessible and that treatment options are there for people too is obviously much easier said than done, but it's doing its part to hopefully mitigate those types of issues.
Yeah, I'd say destigmatizing conversations, because it's really hard. Like if you don't know, you don't know. It's really hard to kind of predict if somebody's presenting happy with life. It's a really hard one. But I think destigmatizing conversations, more mental health supports, more areas to talk, and I think that's super important.
Correct. And then there's some questions about who Twitch is. Stephen Twitch Boss is a former professional dancer, as well as the DJ on the Ellen DeGeneres show. So And then just briefly, again, I think this can be its own webinar and we'll probably include a resource as this as well. But you mentioned those in diverse populations who are a higher risk for depression and suicide. Do you have experience with those who suffer from depression and suicidal ideation because they feel discriminated against because they are white, male, middle class? And how do you navigate this?
Because of why? Sorry, I didn't catch the last one.
It says because they feel discriminated against because they are white, male, and middle class.
Like white, male, middle class discriminated?
Correct. That's what the question's asking.
I don't really, I work with, working with Indigenous populations back in Alberta, I think I see a couple of communities I worked with, high suicide. Within the community, lots of discrimination, social exclusion, high rates of addiction, intergenerational trauma. That's kind of, and then to us LGBTQ plus community, I don't have a whole lot of experience with like kind of middle-aged white men and discrimination. Yeah, sorry.
And then, like I said, we'll include those types of things as additional resources, specifically for like minority groups, like you mentioned, the Indigenous population, as well as 2S LGBTQ+, the Black community, and so on. We'll include additional resources that we can further engage with. But unfortunately, that does come to our time. There are lots of questions, but we'll try to include as many resources as we can. Just to echo what everybody's saying in the chat, thank you so much, Ryan, for another informative, insightful presentation. Your expertise is always benefited and always appreciated. So thank you so much again, Ryan, for a lovely presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone for stopping by, and always happy to do this, Bill.
And I will echo and say this is the most attended webinar we've had, so this is great. There is over 950 in the room at one time, which is fantastic. So thank you so much again for everyone attending today. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending out a copy of today's recording, the slides that Ryan displayed, as well as additional resources speaking to a plethora of your questions. That will be sent sometime mid to late next week, and it will also include a copy of your CEU certificate. Until then, take care.